In the ever-murky waters of the 16th century French politics, no event loomed larger than the wars of religion. And, at the center of it all, stood a young couple, Henri of Navarre, son of Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, and Marguerite de Valois, daughter of Catherine de Médicis, Queen Mother of France and the ultimate master of the long game. So today, we will look at how this young couple got together. But first, a brief inventory of France's key political factions at the time. On one side, the conservative Catholic aristocracy, spearheaded by the ever-pugnacious House of Guise. Their de facto leader, François de Guise, was Catherine's most powerful and dangerous rival. With vast estates and the adoration of zealous Catholic supporters, the Guise family represented a Catholic absolutism so severe it made even Catherine, a woman who rather liked control, rather nervous. Opposing them in the southwest were the Huguenots, the French Protestants, concentrated in Navarre and led by none other than Jeanne d'Albret. She was more than just a thorn in Catherine's side. She was also family, because she was a cousin of Catherine's late husband, Henri II. And as such, Jeanne's son, Henri of Navarre, held a legitimate and inconvenient claim to the French throne. And now, buoyed by the rapidly expanding influence of the Protestant cause, she was beginning to look less like a provincial monarch and more like a rival queen. Then we come to Catherine herself, the third force in this triangle. Her sons sat on the French throne one after another, but none of them had the vigor to rule the country in their own right, and Catherine remained the de facto power in France. And she ruled not with an army, but with ambiguity. Her favorite tactic? Divide and conquer. She played her enemies off one another with the finesse of a tightrope walker, delicately balancing the opposing powers, sometimes shaken, but never quite falling. But the balancing equation she was solving was far from simple. The Guise family, bolstered by the fervor of most French Catholics, were too dangerous to confront directly. A misstep there could spark revolt, or worse, draw the ire of foreign allies like Felipe II of Spain, self-proclaimed defender of the Catholic faith, and not a man known for his subtlety. At the same time, the Huguenots were no easier to handle. Granting them too much religious freedom risked inflaming the Catholic majority. But crushing them entirely? That would leave her face to face with the Guise, and that was a confrontation she was not certain she could win. And so, Catherine could not destroy the Guise, nor could she eliminate the Huguenots. Instead, she wanted them to remain locked in perpetual conflict, neither side growing strong enough to challenge her directly. Her survival depended on keeping both distracted by each other. As we discussed in our last video, Jeanne d'Albret's son, Henri, later to be known as Henri of Navarre, grew up in close proximity to Catherine de Médicis' children. But at age 13, his mother, Jeanne, finally managed to bring him home to their stronghold at Béarn. And since then, young Henri grew into a bold and assertive youth, by all accounts uncommonly brave for his age. At just 15, he was already marching onto the battlefield, an adolescent general in a kingdom ablaze with the religious war. By this time, the wars of religion had escalated again to a fever pitch. France was fragmented, and no corner of the realm remained untouched. Now the Huguenot forces gathered at La Rochelle, which was a fortified port on the western coast and a Protestant stronghold. But as they were preparing for a major confrontation with the Catholic armies, a devastating news came. Louis, Prince of Condé, the commander-in-chief of the Huguenot forces, had been captured and executed by Henri, the Duke of Anjou, Catherine de Médicis' third son, and the future King Henri III. The execution was brutal. Condé's body was paraded ignominiously on the back of a donkey and was subjected to the jeer of cackling mobs. It was intended to humiliate not only the man, but the cause he led. With their general fallen, command of the army passed improbably and perilously to the young Henri of Navarre. He was scarcely more than a boy, but fortunately the experienced Admiral Coligny stood at his side, offering the gravitas and the strategic acumen that Henri did not yet possess. Still, the tide did not turn immediately. The Huguenot forces suffered loss after loss. Morale was disintegrating. But then, Jeanne d'Albret arrived at the battlefield. Her presence was said to have been electric. Addressing nobles and soldiers alike, she delivered a speech infused with conviction and resolve. She spoke of faith, of purpose, of what remained to be fought for, and the shattered ranks began to reform. Under her renewed leadership, the Huguenots regained their footing. Battle by battle, they pushed forward. They advanced as far as the city of Poitiers, laid siege to its walls, and assailed it with fierce determination. The siege ultimately failed, but word of this Protestant resurgence soon reached Paris, and with it came alarm. Catherine de Médicis, the great puppeteer of court politics, recognized the shifting threat. Even with the death of Prince of Condé, the Huguenot forces, it seemed, were no longer merely a thorn in her side. They were fast becoming a credible alternative power. And so Catherine reached for a different weapon, diplomacy. Her solution was as elegant as it was dangerous: marriage. A union between Henri of Navarre, son of Jean d'Albret, and her own daughter, Marguerite de Valois, known to many simply as Margot. The match was strategic genius. The two were of the same age, had grown up together, and knew each other very well. A royal marriage, Catherine believed, would accomplish several things at once. It would bind the Protestant leadership to the crown, neutralize the Huguenot threat from within, and offer a pretext to end the war. And even more subtly, the marriage would divide the Huguenots themselves. The hardliners, predictably, would cry betrayal, but the moderates, those weary of endless campaigns and mounting losses, would welcome it as a path to peace. As for Jeanne d'Albret, she had little choice but to take the proposal seriously. Continued war was untenable. Resources were stretched, morale was becoming frayed, and Paris itself remained a distant dream. Moreover, there was the matter of succession. Catherine's sons were famously frail. François II was already dead. Charles IX was sickly. The remaining brothers were, to put it charitably, not in the best of health. And there were rumors that the next one, Henri, preferred the company of young men over women. Should her son Henri marry Margot and bide his time, he might, one day, ascend the French throne just by process of elimination. Jeanne even entertained the idea that Margot could be persuaded, gently of course, to convert to Protestantism. But as negotiations began, a new player entered the game. Elizabeth of England, ever the pragmatist, suddenly expressed interest in marrying young Henri herself. She was 20 years his senior, and her offer was never entirely serious. Rather, it was a move to disrupt Catherine's plans. A Catholic Protestant royal marriage in France would mean reconciliation, peace, even unity. And that was something that Elizabeth didn't want to happen. She would much rather have the French divided internally and fighting amongst themselves. But Jeanne was no fool either. She saw through Elizabeth's maneuver. Politely flattered, but fundamentally unmoved, she redirected her efforts to the negotiation with Catherine. And so, in early 1572, with cautious optimism and a lot of apprehension, Jean d'Arbrey headed to Paris for formal negotiations for her son's marriage. Jean d'Arbrey had never been in robust health, and now, seated across the formidable Catherine de Médicis, Queen Mother, master strategist, she found herself slowly worn down. Even though Jean had arrived in Paris with military victories behind her and demands in hand, she found her negotiation counterpart utterly disarming. Catherine countered Jean's honest, principled arguments with smiles, evasions, and the occasional well-timed jokes. It was maddening. Jean, ever serious and firm in her convictions, felt herself slipping into a game she had not agreed to play. But she was too deep in the negotiations to walk away now, and finally an agreement was reached. The marriage contract between Henri of Navarre and Marguerite de Valois was formalized at the Château de Blois. And yet, what Jean saw behind the scenes disturbed her deeply. The French court was much worse than she ever remembered. Amidst the splendor, a moral chaos reigned. At royal balls, couples would disappear mid-dance, only to return later, perhaps a little bit disheveled, but with no questions asked. The women of the court, many of them part of Catherine's infamous flying squadron, which was a circle of seductive female spies, wielded their charm. In this circle, men did not pursue women, but instead women lured them in. It was a culture designed to distract, entrap, and control. And to John, who was a devout Calvinist, the whole scene was appalling. It was Sodom dressed in silk. So she summoned Margot, her soon-to-be daughter-in-law, and offered a stern rebuke. What began as an advice quickly turned into scolding. Jean, by today's standards, might be accused of lecturing like an old-fashioned boomer. Still, Margot was a clever girl. She listened to Jean's lecture politely, and when Jean pressed her to convert to Protestantism, Margot deftly evaded the issue with vague answers and a smile. She was, after all, Catherine's daughter. With the marriage agreement signed, Jeanne wrote to her son Henri to summon him to Paris. But something didn't feel entirely right. The atmosphere at court, the duplicity of the negotiations, it had all left a bitter taste in Jean's mouth. And so, in her letter to Henri, she outlined a plan, a coup. Catherine was to be removed, her sons eliminated, and the French throne seized. Jeanne, believing her correspondence is safe, sent it with a trusted messenger. But the messenger never reached Béarn. Just around the corner, the back of his head had an intimate encounter with a club, shall we say, and the letter promptly ended up in Catherine's hands. The Queen Mother read the treasonous contents and, with chilling calm, resealed the letter and sent it on its way to Henri exactly as Jeanne had intended. A trap has been laid. Henri received the letter around March 23, 1572, and began his journey northward. But it was no swift dash. He moved deliberately, gathering Huguenot allies as he went. The closer he drew to Paris, the more Protestant nobles and troops fell in behind him. And then, as he crossed the Loire River, came the news. His mother, Queen of Navarre, Jean d'Arbrey, was dead. He was now King of Navarre. The shock was overwhelming. Henri had never imagined life without his mother. In his grief, a darker suspicion started to arise. Poison. Catherine de Médicis had a reputation. Many believed that when persuasion failed, she reached for poison. And Jean's death, so sudden, so untimely, seemed far too convenient. Henri's companions were furious. The air was thick with accusation. Now, all eyes turned to Henri. Would he turn back? Or would he ride into the city that may have orchestrated his mother's death? Most of Henri's advisers pleaded with him to turn back. It was too dangerous. They killed the queen. Who knows what they are planning to do to Henri? Henri now faced a terrible decision: reject the royal alliance, accuse his prospective mother-in-law of murder, and prepare for an all-out war. Or carry on with the wedding in the hope of peace, even if his bride's mother might have murdered his own. Everyone around him had an opinion. His mentor, Admiral Coligny, was against the marriage, seeing it as a trap. Most of Henri's advisors told him to turn back, but Henri chose to go to Paris anyway. Why? First, war was exhausting, expensive, and came with a lot of sacrifices. If peace could be secured at all, especially peace crafted so painstakingly by his late mother, then maybe it was worth the risk. He figured if something seemed fishy once he arrived, he could always storm out, sword in his hand, and launch a war once he got back to his base. He wanted to give the peace and his mother's legacy a chance. And then there was Margot. He was 19, and he had grown up with her. He knew exactly how beautiful she was. And, let's be honest, turning down a marriage with a woman you had liked since childhood, only to go fight in the mud again, isn't exactly tempting. So maybe, just maybe, love, or at least hormones, played at least a small part in this political chess game. And what followed was one of the darkest chapters in French history, a night of blood, betrayal, and unspeakable violence. And we will turn to that in our next video.